Hello and welcome to this video about different versions of the Bible. I made this illustration here that I know is not very symmetrical, but if you'll excuse that, it is over the law or the 5 books of Moses, the prophets and the Psalms, or what is in Judaism is called the Hebrew Bible, or in the Old Testament it's called the Old Testament in Christianity, and the different versions of it that were made, and I will try to explain how this works. I don't want this video to be about accusations of deliberate changes that often comes up when it comes to this topic, and I don't want to make a video about what should be the official version of your particular religious group or what your group should favor. I just want to explain the topic, not very extensively, but in some detail, so that you can more easily get an overview of the different versions of the law, prophets and psalms. So under the line we have the time before the birth of Christ, what is called the Second Temple period. Well, I guess also some decades into the Christian calendar is also the end of that period, but this is where before there were divisions on questions of who the Messiah is. So before the Hebrews that lived in Judea split into the Hebrews that followed Pharisaic and eventually Rabbinic Judaism, and the ones that followed Christianity, and early on got Greek and Assyrian and other type of converts to join the religion. The Dead Sea Scrolls from those older times were ancient Hebrew versions of those books, but has only survived in fragments. And Semitic languages that are written with the abjad consonant letters like Aramaic and Arabic. In these languages there are ambiguities exactly what vowels were used and the grammar structure and what the exact meaning of certain words were. We will sort of get a picture by comparing Akkadian and later forms of Hebrew and Greek transcriptions of Hebrew names, but not exactly. The Septuagint was first a Greek translation of the 5 books of Moses, but the prophets and psalms were also at some point translated before or around the birth of Christ, before mostly, it is believed. So on the left we have the Rabbinic branch. When the two religions split off, that group produced the what's called the Biblical Hebrew and Biblical Aramaic versions of the books, as well as Jewish Aramaic Targum versions also. Masoretic means tradition, Mesorah, tradition, and this branch made vocalized versions with vowels and grammar rules and word interpretations, and we don't know exactly how much it represents ancient, but to a certain extent it is a continuation of the language. We know through Greek transcriptions of Hebrew names that at least some of those ancient Greek translators had some differences. There are some ways, that the language was probably preserved in some way, but also there are clear differences in the passages. And comparing both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, compared with the oldest medieval complete biblical Hebrew text with vowel symbols, the copy called the Leningrad Codex. This was around the year 1000 AD, so quite some time after the split between the religions. Targum Onkelos is a version of the books of Moses in Jewish Aramaic, and it is debated exactly when it's from. Might be the early centuries, or might be closer to the Middle Ages, at least in its final form, when it, like Hebrew, gets vocalized with vowel symbols. That's probably later on, and then there are also other Targums around the Middle Ages. On the right we have the early Christians that copied and wrote down New Greek translations of the books, and also very early on, probably the 1st or 2nd century AD, the Syriac Aramaic versions that might have been both translated by Jewish and Christian translators, but eventually Jews rejected the Syriac and Greek versions, and only Christians among the Hebrews that were Christians and Greeks and Assyrians kept them, to my knowledge. These were the groups that continued copying and using these versions of the books. Christian Copts in Egypt made Coptic translations, 3rd or 5th centuries. Older Latin translations were made, and then Saint Jerome made the widely accepted Latin translation around the late 4th, early 5th century AD. Also in Ethiopia, the Ge'ez language, which is also a Semitic language related to Amharic, Armenian versions were made around this time, and around the 9th century, they were translated into Church Slavonic, and of all those versions, all of those versions are before the complete Hebrew texts, as we understand the Masoretic text. Some of them agree with the Masoretic, and but also many of them with the Septuagint reading of these type of variations that we have in the different versions. Then I made an illustration of these two branches, or two trees that branches over to, there's a gap that is bridged there, and that is made to represent, in the 16th century Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, and in the 17th century the scholars led by King James translated into English. What was unique about those German and English versions, and many done in Europe and America after that also, is that they were based on the Masoretic texts, what many of the Protestant churches used. If those early Protestants wouldn't have turned to this version, it would have only existed in Rabbinic Judaism. The Hebrew text with the vowels and other symbols are needed for a complete understanding of the language. The Targum, called Onkelos, and the Oral Law are all believed in Rabbinic Judaism to have been given at Mount Sinai. So the letters and the vowels been given to Moses, and Christianity rejects that anything other than the written Hebrew Torah or 5 books of Moses were given at Mount Sinai to Moses. So there's a difference there, and there are now several Protestant groups that are acknowledging that the Septuagint is the one that the early Christians used. So there isn't just one position within Protestantism and the Reformed churches, but there are multiple positions. But this is a simplified version of the Jewish and Christian traditions and what different versions of the law, prophets, and psalms that have been used.